Alrighty, so as I pull up the Bible, gosh, I don't want to leave you guys out of that. There, you can see the Bible on stream. And Isaiah gets started in chapter 2, quoting, or not quoting necessarily, but really reflecting identically what Micah shared. It's not exactly known if Micah quoted Isaiah or if Isaiah quoted Micah, but they both share the exact same prophecy, almost word for word, in Isaiah 2 and Micah chapter 4. And let me just show you. Here's Micah chapter 4. There we go. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it, and many nations shall come in and say, come, let us go to the mountain, to the house of the Lord, the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge between many peoples. Again, we talked about all this last week. They'll beat their swords into plowshares, and neither will they learn war anymore. And then this is where Micah begins to deviate in verse 4. But everyone will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and he goes on. But here's what happens with Isaiah 2. Isaiah goes through much the same thing. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and the nations will flow to it. So it's very same thing. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge between nations and decide disputes for many peoples. And they will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation or learn war anymore. And then Isaiah deviates into a different part of the message. And that's fascinating. I covered quite a bit of the cross-references in detail of that specific prophecy back when we talked about Micah chapter 4. So you can see it there. I've included it in the notes for you, some of the cross-references about the mountain of the Lord, about the Messiah judging the nations, would be cross-references that Micah and Isaiah would have had access to because they were given historically in the past before Micah and Isaiah. So that's all in the notes. And if you want to hear me talk more about that, go look at last week's recording on Micah chapter 4. We're going to move on then to where they deviate where Isaiah deviates from Micah into, oh, the house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. And Isaiah, wow. Isaiah and Micah. I think I just invented something. Isaiah, as he's appealing to Israel to say, let's walk in the light of God's counsel. And maybe even more than that, maybe saying, walk in the light of his city, because the light of the holy mountain itself has a light. John the Apostle, I'm breaking protocol with my chronology, but John the Apostle sees this in Revelation 21, verse 24, where he says, by the light of the heavenly city will the nations walk. And that light may be figurative, but John talks about the city has no need for the sun or the moon. There's no day or night in the city because the city is its own light. And by its light, the nations will walk. That's really literal. And so there could be something more to this. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. I don't know if Isaiah was thinking that. He's probably thinking, let's walk in the Lord's counsel, in his wisdom. Let's reason with the Lord together. Probably what he's talking about, but I think there could be some prophetic overlap with that I think is really neat, especially because of the way John describes it in Revelation 21. And again, I include that in the notes. Once we get into the remainder of Isaiah chapter 2 and into chapter 3 and 4, very much scholars and biblical teachers teach this as kind of a cohesive message. That's kind of why I'm including these all in a single week, because for Isaiah and for his audience, these weren't necessarily broken up in chapters the way we have them now, but they were a cohesive message. That chapter 2 and chapter 3 went together, and chapter 3 and chapter 4 also went together. So as we're looking at these together, understand that the chapter breakdown is a little bit arbitrary in this case, just to help us navigate. But for Isaiah, we're getting into a continuous message. And so here's where we really get into it. The day of the Lord. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they're full of things from the east and fortune tellers, like the Philistines, and they strike their hands with the children of foreigners. Now, what Isaiah is really getting into is essentially Israel has tolerated, well, more specifically, he's going to talk about Judah, the house of Jacob, has tolerated false religion with nations from east to west. That whole from the east to the Philistines is like from east to west. You're just wholesale compromising with these other nations, entering into diplomatic relationships that defile your covenant. The striking the hands with children of foreigners is kind of like reaching agreements, those handshake agreements with children from other nations, the descendants of other covenant of non-covenant nations that are defiling their covenant. Their hands are filled with silver and gold. There's no end to their treasures. Their hands are filled with horses. There's no end to their chariots. Their hands are filled with idols. And so he's really breaking down kind of these three areas where we see their hands are filled with. And God's really addressing Israel's relationship that's being strained by overconfidence in their wealth and in their military and in their false gods. Really, they're really seeking self-assurance and self-determination through their own accumulation of wealth, their own building up of their army, and their own even idolatry and these pagan rituals that they've entered into with other surrounding nations. And then we get into verse 9. And so from here, from verse 9 on through the end of the chapter, a lot of teachers see this as continually being addressed toward the people of Israel. But I mean, it is addressed to the people of Israel, but I think what the Lord is really describing here, and what future prophets later really affirm, is that Isaiah is describing the futility of all this overconfidence, the overconfidence of humanity. And that scope is beyond Israel. And so as Israel has sought to mimic the self-determinative and prideful, overconfident nature of these other nations that are around them, this is Isaiah confronting not just the overconfidence of Israel, but the overconfidence of mankind. And he's beginning to describe to Israel how God is going to judge all mankind. All these overconfident nations will be humbled by the Lord in that day. And that's what Isaiah is really getting into. So as we look at verse 9 and onward, this is not specific and unique to Israel. This is actually the Lord addressing the pride and overconfidence of all humanity at the end of the age. And so none of this is really considered to be historically fulfilled in terms of the scope of all mankind, the pride of all humanity, in any kind of lasting way. So, all right, let's jump into it. Verse 9. So man is humbled, like saying, this is how mankind will be humbled, and each one brought low. Do not forgive them. Basically, take away all of this rose-colored glasses that you have about this pride and overconfidence that even opposes God's covenant with his people. And then you have these statements that occur several times in the chapter. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. Where the appearing of Israel's Messiah in the holy city that we've talked about previously, like Psalm 48 and Micah 7, I want to say. Interesting, because we can go back and cross-reference those. But essentially describing the nations are hiding themselves from the revealing of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. Basically, the glory, the weight of his presence is so large. Now, there are some who would argue that this has a historical fulfillment at the defeat of the Assyrian army right around the turn of the 8th century BC, where Assyria did come against Judah and an angel of the Lord struck down the Assyrian army. Now, that is true. That actually does happen historically, but there's more to this. That was the Lord addressing the pride of one nation, one people who came to invade Judah. But there's a mankind level, a level that applies to all of humanity. That's yet future, and that other prophets will really confirm this. Other prophets who quote Isaiah and quote these passages and apply them to nations beyond just Assyria, so we can know that it's more than that as well. The haughty looks of man will be brought low. The lofty pride of men will be humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it will be brought low. I like to refer to, there's many promises like this that I like to refer to as prophetic promises of God's day against pride. He gives a label or maybe a subtitle to the day of the Lord. It's the day against the prideful overconfidence of humanity as they defile and reject God's covenant. And Isaiah is going to get into more of what that looks like. He describes it as a day when all the pride of all humanity, not just Assyria, but all humanity, will be humbled. And 3 times, Isaiah describes God's adversaries having to shelter in caves and behind rocks from God's presence. We saw that in verse 10, but let me just jump down and show you verse 19. And the people will enter caves and rocks and holes in the ground from before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. And again, in verse 21, to enter into caverns and rocks, the clefts and cliffs before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. This is the Lord's mighty day against the overconfidence of humanity, where all of humanity is humbled before the presence of God as his Messiah comes into Israel, defeats Israel's adversaries, and all those things that, again, Isaiah is going to talk about. What Isaiah just talked about up here in the beginning of chapter 2. I think that's kind of why he starts out with that explanation at the beginning of the chapter. Which again, this is absolutely historically unfulfilled. So there you have that too. So in verses 13 through 16, he's giving references to different examples of national pride and overconfidence of the surrounding nations around Israel as kind of figurative examples. So the cedars of Lebanon, the oaks of Bashan, the lofty mountains, the uplifted hills, every high tower and fortified wall, the ships and the commerce happening across the Mediterranean, all of the overconfidence and pride that the surrounding nations have in their own strength, their own natural resources, their own ingenuity, their self-determination, will all be humbled by the strength of the Lord on that day. The haughtiness of men will be humbled. The lofty pride of men will be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted. And there's this recurring theme of the day when the Lord is exalted. And remember, back up here a couple verses earlier, I know I'm jumping around and I'm moving quickly for the sake of time, but the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of mountains and lifted up above the hills, and the nations will flow to it, and the Lord alone will be exalted. You know, we see that down here in verse 17. So we're really wrapping it together here. The Lord alone will be exalted. The pride will be brought low. And what's interesting is he's going to get into some more promises, but there are a lot of promises about the humble being exalted, about the oppressed, the downtrodden being lifted up. And so we almost see this reversal where globally, this pride, this overconfidence, this just kind of wicked pride is being exalted among the secular culture. But on that day, all of that is exposed and turned over as those who are exploiting the poor are humbled, and those who have been humbled and oppressed and downtrodden are exalted and lifted up. Things reverse and things turn around, which is a beautiful promise that I know we all long for to see in a total way. And there are fulfillments of that throughout history and moments of justice where we see that come through. But there is a final, determined, appointed day when all of that exploitation will be overturned and all of the oppressed will receive justice, the justice they've been longing for. And that is related to the end of the age, where it's accomplished in a global, permanent, the final fulfillment type of way. No temporary fulfillments left. And we just talked about that. In that day, mankind will cast away their idols. And what's interesting about this is mankind, not just Israel, but mankind will cast away their idols, their silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship. And then they, of course, entering into caves. And this is where Isaiah comes back to the point. He says, stop regarding all of these wicked nations that are around you that are puffed up with overconfidence in their military, in their wealth, and in their idols. Stop regarding all these wicked nations. Stop trying to mimic them. Stop trying to mirror their overconfidence and receive that for yourself, whose nostrils are just breath, for of what account is he? When on that day, the Lord alone will be exalted. All right, there's that. If I didn't show that on the stream already. So Isaiah 2 moves pretty quickly.